All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this informational webinar on disaster assistance hosted by U.S. Senator Bob Casey's office and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We're grateful for everyone taking the time to join this call today. I want to start by introducing myself and the other panelists on this call. My name is Andrea Guscott, and I am one of Senator Bob Casey's constituent advocates. Also on this call from Senator Casey's office is Meredith Haas. From USDA, we are joined by Raymond Schaefer, Jim Gillis, Heather Smeltz, and Mark Buckwalter. We're grateful for all the panelists' willingness to join our office for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'll quickly note that if you have any questions, please hold them until the end of the presentation when we'll have a Q&A session. We ask that you please keep your questions general and applicable to as many people as possible since this is a public call. If you have questions regarding your own specific situation, contact information for Senator Casey's office will be provided during the presentation for you to reach out to directly. At this time, I'm going to turn the call over to USDA to delve more into the specifics.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Smeltz. I am an engineer with NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, part of the USDA, and I'm in charge of the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So in 1954, this is an old program. The Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act was authorized by Congress. We fondly call it PL 566. And what it did was it allowed the Secretary of Agriculture to partner with local municipalities or states or counties to work together to prevent erosion, floodwater, and sediment damages, among other purposes. And NRCS has worked to plan and implement over 60 of these projects across the state, and 4 new projects are currently underway. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So I wanted to quickly talk to you about some things about the program that makes a project potentially eligible for this. It must have a flood prevention purpose to it. There's other purposes as well, but for the purpose of this call, we're solely speaking about flood prevention. It also requires a public sponsor. So individual landowners are not eligible for the program, but they can be if they work through either a state, a county, or a municipality to sponsor their project. The projects have to be within a watershed that's less than 250,000 acres. That's one of the reasons it's called the Small Watersheds Program. And that's actually pretty large. That works out to be about 391 square miles. That's a decent sized area, even though it's called the Small Watershed Program. The other thing too is that economics must work out for the project, that it is a good use of taxpayer dollars. And those economics, both the costs and benefits, get determined as the project moves through. Those benefits must be directly related to agriculture, and including rural communities, which normally isn't a problem for a lot of the work that we do, because a rural community is considered that with a population less than 50,000. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. So what are some things that this project or this program can do? What are some flood prevention alternatives that we can use? And if you can move to the next slide, please. Historically, NRCS used this program to build about 85 high hazard flood prevention dams or flood control dams across the state. Across the country, we build almost 12,000. So while there's a lot of our dams out there, they're silent sentinels that are doing their jobs well, and most people don't even realize they're living below one and being protected. But flood detention structures are one alternative, or one thing that can be used through this program to help prevent flooding. Can you move to the next slide, please? Levees and dikes are also used These are probably a little more common nowadays than dams are, but levees and dikes can be used to keep flood waters within their channels and keep them away from houses and other infrastructure. Next slide, please. We can do stream bank and shoreline protection, stabilization type work. That's all part of the authorized purpose as long as it's working to prevent flooding. Primarily that's working to keep the stream, again, keep the stream in its channel itself. Next slide, please. One of the other things that we can do is not what's considered non-structural alternatives. I need to warn you that the picture that you're looking at is only halfway finished. It's showing you that we can work in floodplains to move structures up and elevate homes and help elevate critical infrastructure out of the flood zone if that's being done. Now, by the time this project was finished, there would have been an access built to the house as well as siding and skirting around the front. So it looked like a normal structure instead of a structure raised up on stilts. But we can also, besides the elevating the structures and or elevating critical components, maybe electric panels and things like that out of basements, we can also work to floodproof structures. We can do floodplain management, which could include acquisitions and buyouts, providing funding to move people out of that floodplain. They're constantly being flooded. And we can also work through this program to install warning systems to give people advance notice that the water's rising. Now's a good time to get out. Next slide, please. So the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program is a multi-step project. It also takes a decent period of time. It's not going to be a quick program. That's one of the reasons why I have the slow cooker in the bottom of the picture here. You'll notice that through the process, there's an application that's required and a preliminary investigation feasibility report that basically says, hey, is this a viable project? Does it meet the purposes? Are there going to be any significant challenges that need to be overcome? And if it gets through that part of it, we move into planning, which is a 2 to 3 year, really in-depth feasibility study that says, hey, what are we actually going to do here? How much is it going to cost? What kind of impacts are we going to have, both to the environment, to cultural resources, to ecosystem services? What kind of benefits are we going to have? And then once it's through that planning phase and determined that it should be moved forward, it's a good use of taxpayer dollars, we move into design and permitting and then into construction. So as you can see, it is not a microwave program. It does not go fast. It's very deliberate. It's very public facing. But I always do say that you generally get a lot better food out of a crock pot or a slow cooker than you do a microwave. The other thing to point out about the program is that NRCS may fund all the different steps, that application and preliminary investigation feasibility report, the planning, design, and permitting and construction. We can fund all those at 100%. Now, I do need to be clear, though, that there are some costs that the sponsor is responsible for, such as securing all and any needed land rights, as well as permitting fees. NRCS will also pay, in addition to the construction, for the inspection and the administration of that construction contract as well, which is often an attractive selling point to local sponsors. And if you can move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that, and actually, if you could click through a couple times here. Yep, perfect. I did want to point out some of the different responsibilities for the sponsor. That if there's a community that is interested in a project like this, looking ahead and being on the proactive side of addressing some flooding, there are different things that the sponsor is responsible for. Some of them do have costs to them, and some of them are more administrative. Like I had mentioned, any kind of permits, those are the sponsor responsibility. There is a public participation component. Sometimes there's mailing, sometimes there's posting to websites, phone calls, hosting public meetings, things along those lines. Watershed management, if needed, the sponsor can implement features such as permitting or zoning, land use regulations or easements or upstream watershed protection. There's a financial component. They have to be able to show evidence of being able to fund long-term operation and maintenance of the project, which is a requirement. So NRCS basically will do the project and then turn it over to the sponsor to operate and maintain for the life of that project. Next slide, please. So if you're interested, I have my name and contact information here. That would be your next step, would be to reach out and to one of your local officials or your county or your state to find someone who's interested in sponsoring your project for flood prevention and have them reach out to me. We can talk through the process, come out and meet with you in person, and go through a lot more detail than what we're able to do at this point. But it's a good program. It is a slow moving program, but it's being proactive and forward facing, trying to get ahead of everything instead of dealing with it on the backside. So with that, Mark, I think I'm transitioning over to you to talk about our other program that can help on that backside after you've already been hit by a storm. Mark?
Am I good to go, Andrea, or do you have any intro?
Nope, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so yeah, it's a very good segue from Heather there. Her program is very flood protection and kind of looking forward and long-term planning, where this next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to talk about our Emergency Watershed Protection program, EWP. It's more of a response to a disaster or flooding. And certainly on the slide is my contact information. And you could certainly reach out to me if there's anything that comes up. But this is a lot of similarities and components as Heather's program that she talked about, and some very big differences. So with that, jump to the next slide. So a program overview. It's a federal emergency recovery program that helps local communities recover from a natural disaster. A lot of times in Pennsylvania, that's flooding or just, basically flooding, intense rainfalls over a short period of time that can cause severe channel degradation. The program offers technical and financial assistance to help local communities relieve imminent threats to life and property caused by a significant event or natural disaster that has caused a watershed impairment. The program assistance may be made available when a presidential declaration has been made, or it can also be declared if the NRCS state conservationist declares an event and makes the program eligible. So in a lot of ways, this is a FEMA-oriented disaster relief program. It works a lot like FEMA's public assistance program. And actually, if there is a presidential declaration, NRCS and FEMA would work hand in hand in those areas. But often, FEMA has to assess damages, and some counties do not meet the threshold, but NRCS and the EWP program can somehow often widen that area and include more counties and offer some relief to areas. So that's a big difference, is our state con is able to offer this program to areas. And to the right is actually a wall and a site that became eligible from tropical storm. It became Ida in 2021. Next slide. Program eligibility and requests for assistance. Like Heather's program, the recovery program begins with a request from a local sponsor, legal subdivision, state or tribal government. Typically, that is a city, a county, towns, conservation districts who NRCS partner with a lot in each county, municipalities. Often we'll have watershed groups this past go around that came forward and were interested in sponsoring. So on the right side is actually a letter that gets submitted saying a sponsor is interested in sponsoring. And NRCS While public and private landowners can apply for the program, they must work through a local sponsor. So we often help local individuals reach out to sponsors, but ultimately an interested landowner has to get a sponsor in order to be eligible. And one single sponsor can sponsor multiple projects. So often a county-wide sponsor is nice because they can come in and sponsor a bunch of individual projects. Requests for assistance must be received by NRCS within 60 days of the event. So there is a timeline to this program. It is an emergency program. So sponsors must be aware of that deadline, and then even subsequently sites coming forward there's a deadline to when they need to come forward. With that said, NRCS will do all eligibility determinations and if eligible and a sponsor is on board within 120 days of the event, what we call a DSR, a damage survey report, is completed by NRCS, which kind of does overall planning. It says, is it economically, environmentally, and socially sound before it moves forward into the program. Next slide. Typical sponsor responsibilities. We do have a big, thick national sponsor guide that is available, but I did bullet point some of the typical responsibilities for a sponsor. First and foremost is to request assistance by that form I showed on the previous slide. And then the sponsor would enter into a cooperative agreement with NRCS, which will spell out responsibilities for the grant funding and the project. The sponsor will contribute a share of the project costs, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. Well, they'll be required to obtain necessary real property rights, water rights, and regulatory permitting. I have an asterisk here, but prepare a design package. With the design package, they'll solicit a contractor to perform the work and measures. So that's the big component of the sponsor, is to hire the contractor to perform the work. They might be asked to perform construction inspection. And then another component is to agree to provide operation and maintenance of the completed practice. So the life of the project, they'd be required to maintain that. So the asterisks, I have an asterisk there because NRCS has area offices and tech offices that have technical staff that are typically able to prepare design packages and perform construction inspection, which is a big part of the whole project. So often we can provide a design and the on-site inspection to the sponsor, so permitting goes really quite easily because we're providing and helping them step through that. So it's a really collaborative effort between NRCS and the sponsor on projects like this. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about financial assistance through this program. NRCS may pay up to 75% of the cost of construction of eligible recovery measures. So eligible, so we're looking at just addressing the resource and can't fund anything above and beyond that. For communities designated at limited resource area, NRCS may pay up to 90% of construction cost. Currently within Pennsylvania, we have no counties that qualify as LRA, but we are able to look in certain communities at a community level and try to see if they would qualify. And that is an option that can be done. But beyond that, 75% cost share is what NRCS can contribute. Sponsors must contribute the remaining 25% of construction costs. This may be in the form of cash or in-kind services. However, the sponsors may seek non-federal grant funds to cover the remaining 25%. And actually within the past few EWP events, PADP through their Stream Improvement Program has been able to partner with NRCS to provide local sponsors with the remaining 25% match of construction funds, which is huge. So we have a good relationship with the stream improvement program and are able to line up our funding to provide 100% of the construction cost. And then on the right is some before and after pictures of the storm events in 2020 or 2011. So we had a lot of projects that year with Hurricane Lee and Irene. Next slide. Eligibility criteria. The PA State Conservationist has determined that the scope of eligible sites is currently limited to the following situations. So getting into what sites are eligible, full-time residents or businesses located within 50 foot of a stream channel and it has experienced severe bank erosion, which now is causing an imminent threat to the property. And imminent is a judgmental call that NRCS will make, but it needs to be severe erosion in all circumstances. Businesses or outbuildings and seasonal homes, detached garages, those types of things are not eligible. It can protect affected public utilities, and that distance is reduced to 10 feet from the stream bank. Deposition and debris removal, such as trees or a significant rock that flushed into the stream channel, may be removed as a component, but it would need to be qualified within the 50 foot of a stream. An asterisk, the eligibility is not guaranteed. And a few things that I didn't add on here I wanted to highlight is, again, for a project to be eligible, it needs a sponsor. It needs to be brought forward within the window for the disaster, and the damage must be related to the disaster that's being accounted for. Next slide. Here's a few. I'll quickly go through these. What the EWP program cannot be used for. It cannot be used to make a structural repair more than 2 times in 10 years. So that it'd have to wait longer than 10 years to do it a third time. For existing operation maintenance, so the program can't be used for O&M. So if a wall is greater than 50% intact and hasn't completely failed, often we'll consider that an O&M issue and not something we can help with. It cannot be used to repair, rebuild, or maintain private or public transportation facilities. So bridges and road repair is not eligible. Strictly stream banks and erosion. It cannot be used to repair, replace physical structures. So if a patio is damaged, a deck is damaged, it cannot be, that would not be a component of the repair. When activities are taken by the sponsor or landowner before signing an agreement, so if repair has already begun, we cannot be considered eligible. It cannot be used to install on other federal agencies or federal lands, and it can't be used to repair non-structural management practices such as conservation tillage or other practices, which I think other programs are out there to do. And then on the right is another before and after for a typical site. And I think my last slide next. Just to highlight our previous events in Pennsylvania. The biggest one was Tropical Storm Ida in 2011. Many of you probably remember that. We had 35 eligible sites and 33 ended up being constructed over 13 counties. And we had 15 sponsors for that event. Came close to right around 2.8 million. There's the funding breakdown listed. And through the program, we're able to protect 43 residences and businesses, which house 94 individuals. So a lot of good protection with the program. And then we currently have an event rolling for July 23 storms in kind of the Berks and Southeast region. And we have 17 damaged sites currently that we are working our way through. I think that's my last slide.
Yes, hello, I'm Jim Gillis. I'm the Farm Program Chief for the Farm Service Agency here in Pennsylvania. And what I'm going to be talking about here today is a slightly different take on how USDA can assist folks who have been affected by disasters. Most of what the Farm Service Agency can provide through our farm programs, at least, is assistance when there was some sort of a revenue loss or an income loss associated with those same natural disasters. Here on my opening slide, you'll see some of the common situations that sort of trigger our ability to provide assistance. Again, as others have mentioned before me, particularly Mark, we are looking at designated disasters. It has to be something that can be either verified or selected as a natural disaster presidential declaration. Sometimes the Secretary of Agriculture will make designations for us and things along those lines. They typically go hand in hand with state designations as well. In all of our cases, we are typically looking at providing assistance for crop loss or livestock related losses. And that's why you see the pictures here. Most of these areas are showing losses or events in the fields that would result in a loss in crop production. For example, drought in the largest picture, significant erosion in the top right picture in the orchards, a hay field with large erosion through it, a crop field with large erosion through it, which was also from sort of that Lee and Ida time period, and then large areas of erosion with stream bank collapse and things like that in pasture or forage situations. Next slide, please. So we actually have many disaster-related programs. Some of them are long-term and they've been around for quite a while and have jumped across many different farm bills. Others tend to be a little bit more short-term, temporary, and they just pop up in relation to very specific situations. And we call those ad hoc, and they are much less predictable than the long-term ones. But participation in any of these programs with FSA relies on having that designated disaster, and they typically flood, drought. We've had some tornadoes recently that qualified, and it has to be that designated disaster caused higher than normal losses. And when I say higher than normal, what I mean is that for crops, there's usually a certain amount of wiggle room. Some crop fields will produce very well, other crop fields don't produce quite as much. So when we say there has to be a higher than normal loss, we will not be looking at the absolute best production that a person ever had and saying, okay, well, it rained many, many days. You had extreme wet conditions. So therefore, we're going to compare it to your very best fields. That's not the case. We will compare it to a more average situation. In terms of livestock, we cannot look at a situation and say, okay, you had a drought. Let's actually switch to the tornado. You had a tornado that came through and killed 3 of your cows or 3 of your horses. In reality, if your normal mortality, if you typically lose 3 cows or 3 horses a year to anything from disease to old age, things like that, that is not a higher than normal loss then at that point. If you normally lose 3 animals and an event happens that you've now lost 15 animals, obviously that's going to be higher than normal loss, and that would be a qualifying event at that point. Next slide, please. And here's the example. A tornado, let's say a tornado hit Bedford County and destroyed 500 bushels of fresh market vegetables. Their normal annual losses were only about 10 bushels. So you have a higher than normal loss. USDA would declare the tornado as a disaster. If they declared a disaster, then we go to this conclusion that affected farmers in the affected area who participate in one of the disaster programs may receive funding to help offset the lost crop values. Notice there are 3 contingencies there. You have to be an affected farmer. So if you're in an area where this tornado touched down, but the tornado jumped your farm or it didn't affect your property, then obviously you weren't affected by it. The event has to happen to the fields and to the crops in question. Obviously, in the affected area, just because you're in Bedford County doesn't necessarily mean that you were hit by this tornado. As Mark mentioned, we had some storms in Berks County, and we had a small tornado or two down in York County, southern York County this year. Those areas have been designated as being able to receive some of this USDA funding, but it's only the affected areas. So if the tornado impacted half of the county, the southern half of a county, then just because you're in the county doesn't mean the northern half of the county qualifies for that as assistance. It has to be the affected area. And then finally, you have to be participating or signed up for these programs to receive any benefits from them. You can't have a loss. Think of it just the same as insurance. You can't have a loss and then go in and sign up and say, I would like to insure the farm. I'd like to insure my house that just got crushed by a tree. It had to be insured first. And that's the way these programs work as well. For a minimal annual fee, which is really, really minimal, a person can opt to get this coverage on their crops or on their livestock, knowing that if there is an event of some kind, then we would be able to reimburse them a portion of the losses that they have. Next slide, please. Participation will also require establishing your eligibility with FSA, and it's worth noting that establishing eligibility is a requirement of just about all USDA programs. Some of the ones that Mark and Heather mentioned have slightly different eligibility requirements, but to participate with almost any program within the Farm Service Agency or the Natural Resources Conservation Service, you will have to establish your eligibility, your farm records, basically to designate where you are in the county, which fields are yours, things like that. And in most cases for our disaster programs, you have to register for the program annually, and in some cases, paying that yearly premium for the insurance. As I mentioned, this isn't something that can be installed retroactively. You have to say before a potential disaster that you would like protection from disasters, rather than having the disaster occur and then coming back and saying, I'd like to buy insurance for this disaster that already happened. Very, very similar to commercial flood insurance. If you don't have it, the insurance company isn't going to come help you. That's not a great analogy because we're nicer than most insurance companies, and we will do everything that we can to help you. However, you do have to be registered in advance. Next slide, please. So here's a crop-based example of one of our programs. The long name for it is the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program. We always call it NAP, just because that's a whole lot easier to say. And it is basically crop insurance, as I've referred to it a couple times already. But this is crop insurance for those crops that can't be insured by other sources, because crops can be insured through commercial outlets. But they only insure certain things, certain common crops like corn and wheat and soybeans. Our NAP program can actually do some of the more specialized ones, things like hay, cut flowers, maple sap, and a few other things that you won't find on the commercial market for insurance typically. They still follow the same rules that I mentioned from my previous slide, but they cover a broader range of crops. And oftentimes these crops have a higher value in a smaller area on the landscape, so that if a tornado touches down, it may be more likely to take out an entire cut flower crop, for example, rather than just a portion of it. So that's one thing to consider, is that if you have a high value, small area crop, then this kind of a program might be ideally suited for you. Next slide, please. And now a livestock-based example. We have a program called the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. Again, it's the government. We love acronyms, so we call this one ELAP. It helps to offset income losses when livestock, and you notice I put that in quotes, and I'll come to that in a second, whenever livestock suffers higher than usual mortality because of those designated disasters. So let me say right up front that we often get requests for, um, I had a coyote come through and kill 5 of my lambs if I have a sheep operation or something like that. Can I get assistance from ELAP? Um, Probably not in that case, because remember, we're talking about natural disasters. And in most cases, predator attacks are not considered natural disasters and can't be claimed. If you had those same 5 lambs killed by a tornado, again, we'll go with that example, or flooding, that was a declared disaster, then yes, you may be eligible, but it still has to be that higher than average loss. So if you normally have 10 lambs lost in the course of the year, and 5 of them this year were lost for um, because of the flood or because of the tornado, then it's questionable. You still should come in and ask that about that scenario with FSA, but you have to keep in mind that we are looking at higher than average losses. And the reason I had livestock in quotes in the text of this slide is that not only does it cover typical livestock, but it can cover things like poultry, honeybee production, and several other less common types of livestock: emus, ostriches, rabbits, mink, anything that has a cash value as a raised livestock. It does not cover wild animals in any way. It has to be a raised, domesticated version of those animals. And just to reinforce the part about the bees, we often sort of in passing refer to ELAP as actually BLAP, because many bee producers in Pennsylvania participate in this one to gain some protection for their hives as a highly valuable commercial crop. Next slide, please. I believe that may have been my last one. Oh, nope. One thing I want to point out about disaster programs is that all the programs themselves, the items that they cover, the payments that they offer, the eligibility requirements that go into these programs, and the qualifying events. So those natural disasters. One part of the state may have a drought, another part of the state may have a flood, one part of the state may have a late freeze, for example, that affects vegetables or orchard crops. Those things all change frequently. We can't predict those. All we can do is track them. So if you have interest in any of these, we strongly, strongly recommend that you check in with your FSA office regularly. We cannot post every time we're going to say that there's a natural disaster, that a natural disaster has occurred. It just, there is no way to track all of these things and keep up with it from a public relations standpoint. So if any of the things that I've mentioned earlier appeal to you or your operation, please check in with your local FSA office, get those records established, and stay in fairly regular contact with us so that we can help you when the time comes and if you would like that assistance. I believe that's it for me, Andrea. Yep. All right. Thank you for your time this morning or this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing that important information on the different disaster assistance programs that are available. So now I'm just going to quickly provide an overview on how Senator Casey's office may be of assistance to constituents regarding common issues we see people face with USDA. So go ahead to the next slide. All right, so Senator Casey's Office of Constituent Services consists of a team of constituent advocates who assist constituents who are experiencing issues with a federal agency. This includes, but is not limited to, Social Security benefits, a missing passport, an IRS problem, a VA benefit, immigration snags, SBA concerns, and so much more. Regarding USDA, we can connect with USDA on your behalf if you have a loan or grant application and would like a status update, or if you have a question or concern about a loan or grant you're applying for or have received. We can also contact USDA if you have a loan with USDA, such as a mortgage, and there are missing payments. Our office can also assist with subsidy renewal questions about a loan, And furthermore, we can reach out to the National Finance Center if you are or were a federal employee and have a question or concern about your retirement when it's going through this stage. Let's go to the next slide. If you'd like to request assistance from Senator Casey's Office of Constituent Services, either with a USDA question or for an issue with another federal agency, please do not hesitate to contact our office either at 717-231-7540, option 2, or our toll-free number, which is 866-461-9159. And again, you'd hit option number 2. And you can also reach out via Senator Casey's website, which is www.casey.senate.gov. And we will now open this portion of the presentation for questions for USDA or Senator Casey's office. If you have a question, you may click on the raise hand button, which is at the bottom of the participants list to indicate that you have a question. I'll call on participants that have questions one by one and I'll mute you. And again, please note that this is a public call, so we ask that you please keep your questions general. If you have a specific issue, you can feel free to contact our office via the information that's currently on the screen. And I'll also just quickly note that this webinar was recorded, so we will be sharing this recording to everyone who signed up for this webinar. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Give people a few more seconds to think if they do have a question.
Andrea, I could take this opportunity to go over our emergency loan program that we also have available.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. 1 second here.
Raymond, I do just want to note you are muted, so I don't know if you're still
Goodness,
getting things together.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, I didn't realize it. When did it muted? So, yeah, if you have the ability for an operating loan or an emergency loan, and if the emergency loan were not to be something that would be of a benefit for you, we could also look at our regular loan programs. Normally, our programs we do not compete with other lenders. We are a secondary source of credit, but an emergency situation may be the opportunity where a good time for you to just talk with our credit department and see if we have something that we can assist you with. So, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Raymond. I'll just give a few more seconds to see if anyone has any questions. Again, you would hit the little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen. All right, well, not seeing any other questions. If you do think of a question after the webinar, feel free to reach out to our office with the information on the screen, and we'd be happy to direct your question to the right area. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and also for our participants for providing us with all this very important information. And I hope you'll have a wonderful rest of your day.